Hello, everyone. Let's see here. Whoops. All right, let's go ahead and talk. So we coming back to the database systems CSE 204. And the first thing I want to talk about is the group project. So it looks like all the groups have been formed. So there's actually a slide in this that I'm going to share with you that actually it's not as necessary anymore because you guys have all done it. So great. So all right, so we're going to talk about the project. So some of you have been emailing me and contacting me, asking for more information about the project. So that's good that you guys are already thinking about that. First quote of the day. Today comes from Sherlock Holmes. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So, I don't know. I just like Sherlock Holmes. I like the analytical thinking, right? So, but hopefully you're not just eliminating the impossible when it comes to designing your database, but you're trying to figure out what is possible. All right. So, what are the purposes of having a group project? Well, I want you to be able to gain an understanding of designing and implementing a database system. So I want you to be able to get some experience in a sort of kind of like a real world system. It's, obviously, chances are whatever you design is not going to actually be used by a company somewhere, but it could. It has happened. So that does happen on occasion, but more than anything, it's just kind of on a simple system trying to get you to understand how the design process works. Okay, you need to learn to work together as a team and develop the ability to manage time and roles. So you want to be able to start early and be able to manage your time well, so you're not coming up to the end of the semester trying to rush together a project, because I won't like that. You won't like the results of what happens if you throw together something poorly designed. You won't like the grade that you get, and ultimately, when you get to the real world, when you get to have a job somewhere, your customer is really not going to like that. So yeah, so the whole point, we want to have quality product at the end. All right. You want to be able to discover some limitations, maybe, because you might choose, oh, we're going to do this in MySQL. And as we've talked about last week, there's some things that are in the text, like the check constraints and stuff like that, that MySQL does not support. And so you may have some limitations. Okay. And then that little tiny bullet point there at the end. Okay. Get a good grade, right? Ultimately, I know that's what most of you are here for. What you want is you want to get a good grade so you can move on to the next class, so that you can graduate. My purposes for you is not so much that you get an A or a B, although I would love for you to do that. But my purpose for you is that you gain understanding of how to do all these things, so that when you do graduate and when you do get a job, that you will be a quality, productive employee, and you can represent our university well. Okay? All right, let's go. So, what am I expecting you to give me? Well, you're going to need a fully realized database system. So that means you're going to need tables, views, data that is put into those tables. That second bullet point there about normalized to the third normal form, to the 3NF format, we will talk about that through the next few sets of slides, so you will know what that means later. Okay, but know that that's what we're working towards for the final completed product. Okay, now the well-designed or even working prototype of a user interface, because this class is primarily concerned with you understanding how databases work, I don't expect for this project, I don't expect you to put a lot of time and effort into getting your user interface to work really, really well. Okay. Some people have, and some people have had even working user interfaces. That's fine. Some of the best, though, some of the best projects that I've seen come out of this course have been those who simply did a mock-up of their user interface where they just showed this is what we expect our screens would look like, drawn in Microsoft Paint, or even just sketched out by hand. So don't worry and don't spend a lot of time working on the user interface. I want you to understand the database side of things. The reason why the user interface component is put in there is what use is a database really unless we have access to the data to do stuff with it. It's like, Hepsiburada, Sahibinden, those types of websites, they have all this data that they store in their database, but what use is it if the customer can't access it, right? Unless they've thought through how to get to the data and how to manipulate the data, right? And so I do want you to at least consider how your users might interact with the database, right? But I don't want you to consider yourself as the user interface team on this. Most companies that I've worked for, we had one set of programmers that was they were responsible for the user interface side of things, and the other set of programmers that were responsible for the database side of things. Okay, the database programmers didn't really know a whole lot about how to write code for a working user interface. And those of us who worked on the user interface side of things, we did know something about writing SQL queries because we did need to interact with the database. But as far as how to really write them well, we really needed if we ever had issues where the query was being slow, bottlenecked, something like that, we would go to those database programmers to really have them help us understand how to make those work better. Okay. All right. You will give a report on these things that will include an ER diagram. We'll talk about what that is in the coming weeks. All right. So you will give an ER diagram, some example data, how we might view that. So need some examples of how the data might be viewed. And then finally, a presentation at the end of the semester. Everyone will give a presentation, and every member should prepare some portion of the presentation. I want everybody to present from your group. So if you have a 6-person group, divide up the time of the presentation well so that there's, so each person gets a solid amount of presentation time. Okay. So how do we do this? Well, you're going to need to form a group. Like I said, everyone has been put into a group. There were a few members that were left out. There was just a perfect number of 6 of them. So I went ahead and made a 6-person group out of them. But as far as I know, everyone in this course is now in a group. Okay, so you don't need to worry about emailing me now. What you did note, though, what I did note was every group that I emailed, I said whoever sent me the email, or if you changed this person, everyone has a team leader, a project manager, if you want to call them that. Okay, this is the person that I will communicate with for this project. So your job, if you are the project manager, your job is to make sure that you communicate well between your team members and me. Okay, because I am going to act as the customer in this. So you came up with the idea, but I'm going to say I'm the customer, so I think I know what I want. All right. And so what's going to happen is you chose a project that some of you already have done that, and I've highlighted them on the next page. Okay, so you need to choose a project topic and make sure I approve it. And then what will happen is you will give me near the date of the midterm, maybe a little bit after. All right, you're going to submit an initial version of your database design. I'll have a document here shortly that will explain what the expectations are there. Okay. Then the customer, me, I will review your database and I'll make some additional requests. Okay. And Basically, it'll be stuff like, oh, I really wish you had done this. I wish you had included this. I want to make sure that in the final version that we have this type of functionality. I'll say stuff like that. Okay, so it will reflect some change to your existing whatever you submit the first time, and then then there will be some additional requests they want to add. Okay. So the final submission that in that presentation that you give at the end of the semester needs to incorporate your original design, the first one, the first pass, and the request that I make. Okay. And by the way, customers, they want you to, when they make a request, they want you to do those things. They don't like it if you say, oh no, we just decided not to do that. Okay. I have had some groups who have basically told the customer, yeah, we decided not to do that. Customers don't really like it when you tell them that. Okay. Now that's not to say that certain things aren't impossible. Customers all the time. Okay. Customers all the time ask for things that are impossible, things that technology that doesn't exist. They want stuff that costs a lot more than they think that it should cost. And so sometimes we do have to tell customers, I'm sorry, but I just can't do that. That's impossible. But we need to have a very, very solid reason for why we don't give our customers what they want. Okay. Otherwise, if we just decided, hey, I didn't really want to do that, so I didn't, then chances are we will lose that customer and we'll probably lose future customers as well. All right. Final slide on this. So here's some potential project ideas. Now, all these slides are available on the class materials folder. And what I will do is, as I get emails from you guys saying this is what topic we want to do, this is what project we want to do, what I will do is I will update this slide accordingly. So what you see here is these that are highlighted in red with this check mark next to them. Okay, those are ones that have already been taken by a group. So these are ones that that some group out there has said we want to do this idea. Now, if we had fewer students and if there were fewer groups, I would have said I wouldn't allow any duplicate projects at all. But because we have so many groups, there are 23 groups, and here I have listed 14. Yeah, I have 14 topics. 9 extra topics would be very hard to come by. So what I'm going to allow is that if you see a topic up here that you really want to do, and it's got a red check and it's red text, email me as soon as possible, because as soon as there are 2 groups doing the same topic, so like if somebody emails me saying we want to do the hospital management system, what I'll do is I will change this from a red check and this, I will put a big line through it. Okay. Which means there are 2 groups. Once there's 2 groups that are doing a project, no one else can do it. Okay. All right. So if you see something on here that you want to do, email me sooner rather than later so that you can make sure to get that project. I have had in the past groups who have emailed me saying, I want to do this, but they emailed me literally minutes after another group did, and first come, first serve. So if I get an email from group A saying they want to do something, and I get a second email 5 minutes later from group B saying they want to do that same project, it'll go to group A. Okay. All right. Any questions about that before we move on? Any questions or comments? Nope. Okay, I've got nothing. All right, let's go ahead and continue on where we left off. Let's see, where were we? Dropping views. All right, dropping views. Oh, got a question. Okay, so good question about the red projects. So the red projects are ones that a group has already said they want to do that project, which means that another group can, one other group can do that project, but you need to contact me as soon as possible. Okay, it'll be today. What was I saying? Yeah. So once a second group comes back to me and says, I want to do that project, I will update that slide to have a big line through that project idea, and then no one else will be able to take it. But right now, all those projects are available. And if you want to come up with another idea, you say, you know what, I don't like any of those project ideas, I want to do something else, you're welcome to do that as well. Okay, but you'll need to contact me and I need to approve it. That slide is project ideas that are already approved. Okay, so you don't have to ask me for approval. You can just say, we want to do this project. Okay?
Okay, sir.
All right. So let's talk about how to drop views. Okay, so we talked about this last week. We kind of got into this a little bit last week. So dropping views, just like dropping tables, simply done with the drop keyword. So drop view and then whatever the name is. Now remember, this doesn't carry as much power behind it, if you will, as a table drop, because when we drop the table, we lose all the data too, right? It's like everything goes, the table, the structure, the data inside, everything goes away. Okay. But views don't contain any data to start with. Views are basically just a query that looks dynamically at the data that's there, and whenever we run a select statement using a view, we get access to the data in the underlying tables. So when we drop a view, we're simply saying, get rid of this particular way of viewing the data, this particular query that views the data. Okay, the data doesn't go away, the table doesn't go away. It's just the view. All right. So like I said, it's not as much power. It's just basically gets rid of a specific way to view it. Okay. All right. Now remember, we created this view. Where is it? Right here. Yeah. Okay. So here we created this view called staff property count that tells us how many properties each staff person is managing. Right. Now notice that the only main data columns here come from the staff table. So the branch number, the staff number, and then the count star, because we include this property for rent table here and this linking on the where clause, what we're saying is I want this to tell me for each branch number, staff number combination, I want to know how many rows are there in the property for rent table with that staff number. Okay, so this is a dynamic view. We didn't create a table to store this information. Okay. All right. So what we want to talk about though is how this whole view resolution thing works. Now here, this looks like a query that just selects some columns from a table. Right? But in actuality, we are not getting columns from a table. This isn't a table, is it? This is a view. So this is a view that has two tables in it. So how does this whole resolution, how does this work? How does this do what it needs to do, right? So what it's going to do is first, right, the column names from the select, right, are translated into the column names from the main query. So like this. So we wanted to get the staff number and the count, so we're getting this and this. All right. The view names in the from are replaced with the from list from the defining query, so from the view query itself. So we replace this, replace the from in this query here. We replace this from with this. Now, by the way, what I'm telling you here is this is not what do I wanted to say? This is not what you're writing. You write this. The programmer will write something that looks like this. What we're going through right now is what happens in the system. How does it resolve this query? How does it give us the data that we're looking for? Right? So then the where clause from our user query, which is this thing over here, this branch number, is combined with the where clause of the view query, which was this part here, and we just put an and between them. All right. We just keep that group by and having, and if we had an order by, which we did in our user-defined query, we add that in as well. And so we end up with our query that we wrote. The way the system would see that is they would see it look like this. And this is all done behind the scenes. This is done without us ever having to see any of it. Okay. All right. Let's see. So there are a few restrictions on views. I can't remember which ones right off the top of my head, but a few of these restrictions that we're going to talk about, MySQL actually does support these. So they're actually not restrictions in MySQL. They are restrictions in other SQL-based relational database systems, but MySQL does have some of these restrictions and not all. Okay. So some view restrictions is we would not be able to do something like this. We cannot put a count, an aggregate function, onto another aggregate function. Okay. We also would not be able to do a where clause involving an aggregate function. Because remember, this would basically, do you remember we talked about this where you cannot have as part of the where clause the aggregate function because this would be this should be part of the having clause. Now, I'm almost positive this one is one that MySQL actually does support. So something about the view resolution that MySQL does allow for something like this. Okay. Okay. A view with a group by cannot be joined with a base table. So you would not be able to do a join with that. Okay. One other view restriction is the ability to update the view. The problem is that, so take for example this staff property count view. Now remember what it represents. It's the branch number, the staff number, and the number of properties that person is managing, right? The problem is that we can't just insert 2 into there. Why? Because which 2? Which property for rent should this person be managing? We don't know, right? We cannot insert into a group by view because this 2 here, or all the numbers, I would say this count star over here represents something specific. It represents the number of rows in a subcolumn, in a subtable, in the property for rent table. So by saying I want this person to manage 2 properties, you're saying I want to insert 2 records into property for rent. Well, but property for rent needs all kinds of other information, doesn't it? It needs stuff like stuff like, what's the property number, what's the city, what's the address, what's the rent, what's the amount that the rent is. So, and because we don't have all that information here, we can't just put it in there. Okay. All right. So because it doesn't know which properties they are, it doesn't know how to add to that person. Okay. That doesn't mean that all views are unupdatable. Right? There are some views that we may be able to update. We may be able to use a view to be able to insert or update or delete. Okay. You also think about it this way. Another side of this is if we try to, you might say, well, we can delete, can't we? We can delete this. We don't need to know which properties this person's managing in order to delete them from this, right? Except the problem with that is, what does it mean that they deleted? Well, it means that they're no longer managing any properties. Well, does that mean that we need to delete the person from the database? Maybe. Does that mean that we need to change that these properties that they're currently managing are no longer managed by them? That could be an update statement, right? So because it wouldn't know how to properly handle that situation, this view would be considered not updatable. Okay. Now, okay. Right. So something like this, we could say, okay, well, what if we said, okay, I want the branch, staff, and property number, and then that way now I don't have this aggregate function. If I want to insert into here, I now have the primary key of the property table to insert. This is great, right? So now I can insert branch, staff, and property number. Okay. There's still a problem though with this, because there are some columns in the property table that cannot be null, and we're not giving data to that, right? So this could still present an issue, because if we don't have all the other columns like address, rent amount, and stuff like that, we don't have data for those, but those cannot be null. Okay, but because those columns, address, rent type, that kind of stuff, apartment type or property type, like where it was like flat house, stuff like that, because those can't be null, but we don't have a way to insert values into those columns, therefore we can't update like this. Okay. All right. There are some ways though we can update views, so that if the view must follow these, okay, follow these requirements. I will tell you that for the most part, I've not seen a whole lot of examples of a need to have an updatable view. It is a neat tool to have, that if we have a view that we can use for updating like we would any old table, we can just include that in our user interface side and just access the one thing, the view, and the view for getting data for our user, and then access the same view for updating the data that our user might want to. So it's a neat trick to have. I can tell you from personal experience, most of the systems I've worked on, I honestly have not seen in a real system somebody use an updatable view. Could just be the types of systems that I've worked on though. But what we mostly would do is we would write queries to update the base tables themselves, the underlying tables themselves. Okay. All right. Let's see. I'm going to skip over the with check option stuff, because again, it just has to do with that. I would like you guys to have a good understanding of some of the advantages and disadvantages of using views. All right, so we can customize what the user sees, which is really good. Sometimes that data independence, because if we give our users direct access to the tables themselves, they can do whatever they want with the data, and that could be a big problem. But by having some independence of data, that they can only see what we tell them they can see, and they can't update, especially if we have non-updatable views, then they can't change the data on their own, but we can kind of control what they can update and how they can update it. Think of it kind of like setting a variable in a class, in a Java class, to private, and then having the getters and the setters, right? So we control through the getters and the setters what the users can do in terms of what values they can give to these things, right? But they can see our data, but we are a kind of a line of defense between them accidentally or purposefully changing the data to something that's not valid. Okay, all right. There are some disadvantages. Performance could be a problem. So especially if maybe it might be faster to just maybe the user only really wants to see one column from one table, right? And the where clause really doesn't. The where clause is really just restricting based on some other column from the same table. That could be a really fast query involving a table. But if the only thing we've given that user is access to a view that has a bunch of other tables involved as well, then it could really hinder performance. Okay. All right. Let's see. Let's see. This view materialization and maintenance is basically about how the system behind the view keeps it's kind of like caching. It's kind of like making things faster by only changing stuff in the view result when stuff on the underlying table changes such that the view itself would change. So for example, there's some examples here where it says, view would be unchanged because the same data would still be shown in that same view. So if the data on the underlying table doesn't change what would return, then the temporary data doesn't get changed. Okay, it's something that if you're interested in how systems automatically can help with efficiency, then this is an important topic for you. You would like some of this stuff, but that doesn't really apply to a lot of you in this class. So, but if you're interested, I would say go ahead and look at it. There are two keywords I do want to introduce you to that are very important. Okay, so commit and rollback. Now MySQL does kind of like an automatic commit. All right, we don't see. Well, it does both of these automatically. Actually, it does commit and rollback in my experience automatically. Now, for things that could cause a lot of problems if we're not doing the right thing, like when we drop a table, for example, MySQL comes up with a dialog, a prompt, where it says, "Are you sure you want to run this?" And we click OK, and it does it. Okay, but you can run a lot of update statements and a lot of inserts and kind of one after the other. And in MySQL, the commit is automatic. All right, not in all SQL systems. So the one that I'm most familiar with, Oracle, does not do this. So we can run a lot of insert statements and updates And what happens is my local view of the database, my particular view of the database, sees the changes that I've made. So I can insert hundreds, thousands of rows into a database. I will see those changes. But if someone else, even if my colleague who's sitting in the next cubicle over, if they were to query the database, they would not see my changes. And the reason for this is because it wants to be able to do a lot of like batch inserts, batch updates, and then only push those through once we're sure that that's what we want to do. Okay, so let's say I run all these inserts and updates and stuff like that, and I'm seeing these changes, but my colleague is not. If I do a commit, which the tool we used was called Toad, T-O-A-D. It was a program for running SQL commands and creating procedures. And if I click the commit button, suddenly now my colleague sees my changes. If she were then to run a query to the database, she would see the rows that I've inserted and changed. Okay, we both would. But then let's say if instead of clicking commit, I realize, oh, you know what? I put some wrong rows in there, or I did something wrong. I can click instead the rollback button, and what happens is it undoes all the changes since my last commit. Okay, so now if I do rollback, I don't see any of my changes, and neither do they. Okay, this is especially useful if in running like a procedure that involves like a lot of inserts and updates and stuff all after that, and then some type of error is encountered. It can do an automatic rollback, and then that way, whatever caused that error, we can look into it. But all those records that may now be corrupt data or maybe a problem are no longer in the database. Okay, so if we encounter some type of error, then we can roll back and get out of it and not commit those transactions, not commit those statements. Okay. All right. So again, a commit ends the transaction and makes the change to the database. A rollback gets rid of whatever transactions have happened since the last commit, and we get rid of all the changes made by that transaction. Programmatic SQL is like the PL/SQL procedural language, like a procedural SQL. If the sequence comes to an end and we end our function, right, successfully, it's kind of like an automatic commit kind of happens there. Okay, and then we might have an abnormal program end and the transaction would roll back automatically. All right. Okay. Let's kind of go through this transactions. I don't want to spend too much time here. I want to get to the grants. I get to grants, privileges, and stuff like that. Okay. Because one of the really neat things about having a SQL database is from the database itself, we can control access. So we don't have to have, we don't have to do this through the user interface itself. We can actually tell in the database who, what users or what class of users can have particular privileges to access our database in certain ways. Okay, so we can give different actions. So if these are our actions, right? Select, insert, update, delete, references, and usage. Okay. We can restrict some of these, insert, update, and references, to particularly to named columns. So we might want to say we want to restrict insert on a certain column So we might want to give a user, for example, the ability to let's go with the middle one, update, because it's the easiest one to kind of understand. Let's say we want to restrict update on a certain column in the table. We want to say only certain users can update the salary column on the user table. Now, on the employee table. And what that would mean is that, let's say I'm not in that group. Right. Let's say only human resources is allowed to update the salary column on the employee table. Well, what that would mean is I could see everything. I could see, maybe I could even see the salary column itself, right? But I can't change anybody's salary. Only human resources can do that. And we don't have to do that through the user interface. We can do that through the database itself, right? And then that way, whenever even if the user interface tries to update that column, if the user doesn't have access to do it, then the database rejects the transaction. Okay. One other thing here, to create a view, if somebody wants to create a view, they must have select privilege on all tables. So they must be able to see all the tables that make up the view in order to be able to create a view based on those tables. That makes sense, all right? If you want to create a view that views a certain table, but you don't have the ability to see the data in that table, then you can't do it. All right, that makes sense, right? Okay, so the way that we would grant privilege to someone, okay, so we grant either a privilege list, or we could say all privileges. So we can grant all on some object name. Now this could be a table, this could be a view. So on whatever object we're wanting to grant permission on, grant a privilege on, to, and we can say either authorization ID, so basically who it is, what group or what person it is, or public, which would mean anyone. Okay, so anyone with authorization to access the system in the first place. So for example, let's say I like to use Hepsiburada a lot, right? And let's say that it says public is anybody who can get into their system. Well, that really, I guess for Hepsiburada, that's actually everybody, isn't it? So anybody can view the data, anybody with a web browser, right, can view the data in the Hepsiburada tables, right, in some of them, right? But there are some tables that they may want to say, you know what, we don't want to give that to public. We want to give that only to certain users, okay? And then finally, this optional part, the with grant option, means that anything I've been given, I can give to someone else. Okay, so if I am granted, right, if I'm granted privileges on an object to me with grant option, then that means that I can pass that along. I can also grant to someone else. Okay. So again, all privileges is basically all privileges. Select, update, insert, everything. Let me take a look at your question here, Mustafa. So, well, it took is like with select just means I'm viewing it. Like you didn't change it. If you change, you're saying for in terms of the commit and rollback, whoever was the last to commit, that data is what will be seen by others. So if I understand you correctly, you have not, neither of you did a commit. You selected, you changed, you updated. Your friend then also updated the same data. You would see what you had changed. He would see what he had changed. Okay. neither one of you, it sounds like, would see the original data, which is what everyone else would see. All right. But once one of you commits, if one of you does a commit after that, then whoever committed, that's what everyone else would see. Okay. With the exception of him. So if, let's say, you commit, he will still see what changes he made, not what you did, but everyone else will see what you did. Okay. I hope that cleared that up. Okay. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So let's finish up the grant stuff here. So public allows anyone with access, right? All authorized users will be able to get to whatever we say public to. Okay. And again, with grant option allows those privileges to be passed on to others. So here are some examples, right? Using grant, right? Is we have, so we want to grant all privileges to staff. We'll grant all privileges on staff to manager. So the manager type users will get full access to the staff table. And they have with grant option. And so what they can do is they can pass on any of those privileges to others. So a manager, right now, a manager user could grant, for example, this here. A manager user could run this over here because they can grant, select, and update on a salary column on the staff to other users as well. Okay. So here, now after this point, the personnel and director user types, user roles, they can select from the staff table on all columns. They can change the salary column. They can change the values in the salary column. So they can run an update statement on the salary column. They cannot update any other column. So they couldn't update somebody's sex. They couldn't update a birth date. They couldn't update their name, but they could update someone's salary. Okay. For example, to give all users select on the branch table. So now public, everyone can select from the branch table. They can all see it. Okay. So in order to give, we're going to, if we know how to give privileges, what if we want to take them away? What if we want to get rid of privileges? Like we realize, oh, you know what? Those guys didn't need that privilege after all. Okay. So we would revoke whatever the grant option was, right? For whatever. Now we don't have to revoke all privileges. Let's say we granted, like in this right here, we granted all privileges to manager on the staff table. We might want to only revoke insert. We can do that. We can say revoke revoke insert on staff from manager. Okay. The grant option 4, right, allows any privileges passed on to be revoked separately. Remember, because what happens if we gave, who was it back here? Right here with grant option. We granted all privileges on staff to manager with grant option. Then manager, someone in the manager group, right? So the manager granted this. Let's say the manager person did this one here. Okay. And now let's say we revoke from the manager update. So manager had all privileges. They gave some of those privileges to others. And now we took away from the manager. Well, should those others still have those privileges? if the manager doesn't have them, nor can they give them. All right. Okay. All right. So that grant option 4. All right. The grant option 4 allows for us to allows those privileges passed to be revoked separately. So if we don't use that, then all of them passed on will be revoked as well. All right. Let's take a look at how this might look visually. Okay. Actually, one thing, I want to go to the next slide and then come back to this one. So this would be the syntax for this. We revoke select on branch from public. So now public is no longer allowed to see to select from branch. We could revoke all privileges on the staff table from the director. Okay, so we're going to revoke specific privileges. We can revoke all privileges. All right, and this was whatever privileges were given to the director will be revoked. So even if we only granted select, for example, let's say we granted select on staff, revoking all privileges will just take away select then. Okay. All right. So back to this. So we want to say user A has, let's say they are the God user. They can do whatever. Okay. They grant insert on staff with grant option to user B. Now, user B grants insert on staff with grant option to user C. So now user A, B, and C can all insert to the staff table. Now, user E grants the insert on staff with grant option to user C, which they already had it, but this is just doubling up. Okay, this is just helping. Okay, this is, yeah, someone else who has that access can give it on there. And then user C grants insert on staff to user D. Okay. Now, if we do this, revoke insert on staff with cascade, then what's going to happen is now user B loses that ability to insert to staff. And under normal circumstances, then user C and D would as well. But here, user E had also given that insert, so now user C does not lose their privilege. Okay. Had user E not granted insert to user C, then user C would have lost it as well. If this had not happened, everybody down the line would lose that insert ability. If user E had not done with grant option, then then user C would have the insert ability, but would have lost the ability to pass it on, so user D would have lost it as well. Okay, I want to say that one again because that one might have been confusing. User C, as of step 4, user D has access because user C gave it to them. User C has access because they got it from 2 different people. User B got it from user A. If we revoke, let's say, this is how it works in the current situation, but let's say that user E had not done the with grant option part. Okay. Then when the revoke happened, user D would have gotten their permission from user C, but user C would not have had the ability to pass it on because this was revoked. So user D would lose that ability. User C would still have it because they got it from user E. And then finally, user B would also lose their insert ability because of the revoke here. Okay, I know it can be a bit confusing, but basically, if I gain a privilege from someone who loses the ability to pass it on, then I lose that privilege as well. Okay. All right, we went a little bit over on this first hour, so we'll come back in 10 minutes at 2:40. Okay, and we will move on to database development. We'll introduce that. Okay. All right, so see you guys in 10 minutes.